Jack Donovan had spent the last 16 years behind the wheel of his 18-wheeler, crisscrossing the country on endless highways and treacherous back roads. Over those long, lonesome trips, he had witnessed breathtaking sunrises over barren roads, ominous storm clouds rolling like vengeful gods, and the occasional hitchhiker seeking a ride to the next town. But nothing in his years on the road had prepared him for the bitter winter night that would change everything. That evening, the wind howled against the cab of his rig as heavy snow blanketed the asphalt in a slick white sheet. Jack's knuckles turned white on the steering wheel. He knew all too well that one small lapse in concentration on a night like this could be fatal. A weather report crackled over the radio, urging drivers to stay off the roads, but Jack's shift had run long, and he was desperate to reach the modest warmth of his apartment after nearly 18 exhausting hours on the road. As he rounded a deserted bend on an isolated stretch of highway, his headlights illuminated a shadowy figure by the roadside. At first, he assumed it was a trick of the snow, a stray branch, or discarded clothing, until he recognized the unmistakable shape of a person. Instantly, Jack eased off the gas, turned on his hazard lights, and pulled over a few yards from the figure. Throwing on his thick winter coat, he stepped out into the frigid night, his boots crunching through the fresh snow. The figure was a young woman, curled up in a fetal position and half buried in a snowdrift. She lay motionless, and Jack's heart pounded as he knelt beside her, gently brushing the snow from her face. He discovered her skin was icy, her lips tinged blue. Long, dark hair fanned out against the snow, and she was dressed in a thin coat and dress that did little to protect against the freezing temperatures. She looked as fragile as a porcelain doll. "Hey, can you hear me?" he whispered, shaking her shoulder. When there was no response, Jack's pulse quickened. He pressed 2 fingers against her neck. Her pulse was faint, but she was alive. Realizing that hypothermia was already taking hold, and that time was critical, Jack scooped her up, surprised by how light she was, barely more than skin and bones. He carried her back to his truck. Once inside the cab, he laid her gently in the passenger seat and cranked the heater to full blast. Wrapping a blanket around her trembling form, he unscrewed his thermos, pressing the warm liquid to her lips, urging her to sip. She stirred briefly, her eyelashes fluttering, but remained unconscious. Frustration and worry mingled in Jack's mind. He knew he needed to get her to a hospital quickly. With no time to lose, Jack shifted his truck back onto the road. His tires skidded briefly on the snow, but he regained traction. Every instinct told him that something was amiss. What was a young woman doing alone in the middle of nowhere? Had she been in an accident? Abandoned? The questions whirled through his mind, but survival took precedence over answers. About 20 miles ahead lay a small truck stop, a modest diner with a couple of gas pumps and a convenience store. It wasn't a hospital, but it promised shelter and a working payphone. As Jack drove, the storm intensified, the headlights barely cutting through the thick curtain of falling snow. Just then, a faint whisper reached his ears, a soft, almost imperceptible voice. "Don't let him." Jack's head snapped toward the young woman. Her lips had moved, and though her eyes remained closed, her whispered words sent a chill down his spine. Something was very wrong. When Jack adjusted the blanket around her, a small leather wallet slipped out from her coat and landed on his lap. Hesitant but needing answers, he picked it up and opened it. Inside was her ID card, and the name printed on it made his blood run cold. Mia Dalton. Jack had spent the last decade evading the wrath of Victor Dalton, a ruthless crime lord with an iron grip on the underworld. Now fate had dragged him back into that dangerous world. Jack tossed the ID onto the dashboard, his heart pounding. His mind raced. How had Victor Dalton's daughter ended up abandoned and near death and snow? And more importantly, who was hunting her? Mia had muttered something before slipping back into unconsciousness. Don't let him. But who was him? Jack pressed his phone to call 911, only to be met with a no-signal message. The remoteness of the road and the raging storm had rendered his phone useless. His only option was the truck stop. As Jack pulled into the nearly empty parking lot, the diner's warm interior beckoned like a beacon in the storm. Inside, the smell of coffee and stale cigarettes hung in the air. Behind the counter stood a tired-looking waitress in her 50s, her gray hair pulled back in a ponytail. A lone trucker sat in the corner, silently nursing a cup of coffee. "Jesus, what happened to her?" the waitress asked as Jack rushed over. "I found her on the side of the road," he explained, guiding Mia's limp form. "She needs help. Can you call an ambulance?" The waitress, whose name tag read Helen, quickly moved to the landline phone, but soon returned with a grim expression. "Phones are down. The storm must have knocked the lines." Jack's got twisted. First his phone had failed, and now the diner's line was useless. Too many coincidences. Before Jack could protest, the diner's door swung open with a gust of icy wind. A tall, broad-shouldered man in a heavy black coat entered. His gloved hands were deep in his pockets, and the cold dust on his shoulders gave him a menacing air. Jack's stomach dropped as the man's calculated gaze swept over the room. Without a word, he approached the counter and inquired in a smooth, cold tone, "I'm looking for a young woman. Dark hair, slight build. Has anyone come through here?" Helen shook her head. The man sighed, slid a photograph across the counter, and left as silently as he had entered. Jack's heart pounded. If that stranger was searching for Mia, then the threat was more immediate than he had imagined. The man paused at the door, his eyes briefly locking with Jack's in a silent, deadly exchange before disappearing back into the storm. In that charged silence, Helen's concern deepened. "That was not normal," she whispered. Jack, however, was already making a decision. He knew that walking away wasn't an option. Despite the peril, he would protect Mia at all costs. He carefully lifted Mia into his arms and carried her back to his truck. The storm outside had grown fiercer, as if nature itself was warning them to turn back. But there was no turning back now. Jack locked the doors and started the engine. The cold blue glare of the headlights cut through the swirling snow, illuminating a dark, endless road ahead. Mia stirred beside him, her voice weak. Where am I?" Jack's voice was gentle. "You're safe. I found you out in the snow." But when she noticed the diner's door, panic flashed across her face. "Did you see anyone?" she demanded, her voice trembling with terror. Jack hesitated before answering. "A man in a black coat was here, but I'm not sure who he was looking for." Mia's eyes widened in horror. "He was sent by my father." Jack's heart sank. This was no accident. Victor Dalton's name had returned to haunt him. The stakes were higher than ever. And as Jack pressed the gas pedal, propelling him toward an uncertain future, one thing became clear. He would protect Mia, even if it meant confronting the ghost of his past.